The white one. The clutch had hatched 3 days ago under the twin moons of Vareth Station, and every hatchling had been claimed except one. It wasn't unusual for bonding ceremonies to leave stragglers. Sometimes a youngling was too aggressive, too timid, too small. Sometimes the chemistry simply wasn't there, that invisible current that ran between a hatchling and its chosen partner, the pull that the Krethel called asterisk versathi asterisk, the soul recognition, the thing that could not be manufactured or encouraged or rushed. When it wasn't there, it simply wasn't there, and no amount of ceremony or wishful elder thinking could conjure it from nothing. But this one, this pale, almost translucent creature with eyes the color of faded rose quartz, had been passed over for a reason that went beyond temperament or size, beyond the presence or absence of asterisk versathi asterisk in the hearts of those who had come to choose. The bonding candidates had not even tried. They had seen it and looked away quickly, the way people look away from things that unsettle them in ways they cannot neatly explain. It was white. Not the proud silver white of an elder Krethel in full plumage, not the honorable pale of a warrior's scar scales earned through decades of worthy conflict, not the ceremonial white of the Shell Mother's blessing cloth, not the bright, clean white of a newly polished fang. This hatchling was asterisk albino, a coloration that the Krethel people had considered an omen of weakness for 6,000 years of recorded history, a pigment failure written into the bloodline, a mark that the old texts described in terms that the younger generation found embarrassing to repeat aloud, but had not quite managed to stop believing in their bones. The shell mothers clucked around it nervously in the early hours after the hatching, their taloned feet making soft patterns in the warm sand as they circled the pit without approaching too closely. They consulted each other in low voices. They reviewed with significant eye contact the traditional passages of the hatching codex that addressed anomalous colorations. The passages were old. The passages were also, as the eldest shellmother Savarith privately acknowledged, written by people who had also believed that left-coiled shells indicated bad harvests, and that dreaming of water meant your neighbor wanted your property, and perhaps should be read with appropriate historical distance. But historical distance was difficult to maintain when the thing in question was sitting right there in the pit, being white at you. The ceremony elders had gathered by the second morning and suggested politely but firmly that the hatchling be released into the deep sand. A kindness, they called it, and they meant it, or at least they meant the version of kindness that is really about the comfort of the observer rather than the well-being of the observed. Better than a life of rejection, they said. Better than watching it go unchosen season after season. Better than the slow erosion of an unbonded Krethel aging through its years, without the partnership that their biology and psychology were built around. Without the asterisk versathi asterisk connection that kept their nervous systems regulated and their long lives meaningful. It was, if you squinted at it from the right angle and did not examine it too closely, almost compassionate. Savarith had not yet agreed, she was not sure why. She had been a shell mother for 40 years, which meant she had overseen perhaps 2,000 hatchings and several dozen difficult cases, and she had learned in that time to pay attention to the things she could not explain. Something about this hatchling's stillness gave her pause, not the stillness of resignation, not the collapsed quiet of a creature that had already given up. Something else. Something that felt, when she stood near the pit in the early morning with the twin moons still faint on the horizon, almost like the particular quiet of a thing that knows something the people around it do not. She gave it another day. She told the elders the matter required further consideration. They gave her the look that elders give shell mothers who are being sentimental, and she gave them back the look that shell mothers give elders who have never actually sat with a hatchling through a difficult night, and the matter was, for the moment, tabled. The hatchling, for its part, was entirely unbothered by the philosophical debate being held about its fate. It sat in the warm depression of its hatching pit, a shallow bowl of temperature-regulated sand, the edges still showing the broken curves of its siblings' empty shells, and watched the world with those strange pink eyes in the particular way that very young creatures watch the world when they have not yet learned that watching is supposed to accomplish something. It simply looked. At the sky, at the shells, at the shell mothers when they circled, at the distant lights of Vareth stations, trucker complex glowing amber and white against the desert dark. It ate the insects that wandered into its pit with a swift, economical precision that suggested its reflexes were, whatever the elders thought of its coloration, entirely unimpaired. It slept when it was tired, curled in the deepest warmth of the sand, its pale body barely distinguishable from the ground except for the faint rose glow of its closed eyelids in the moonlight. And between eating and sleeping, it did the third thing, the thing it did most and best. It waited. Not impatiently. That was the quality that Savarith kept returning to in her quiet morning observations. There was no fretting in this hatchling, no anxious circling of the pit's edge, no distress calling, none of the behaviors she had learned to watch for in hatchlings who were struggling emotionally in the first days after emergence. It waited the way certain very old things wait, mountains, maybe, or deep water, with a settled certainty that what it was waiting for would eventually arrive, and that the only reasonable response to the interval was patience. Vareth Station was a fuel and cargo depot sitting at the crossroads of three major hauling routes: the Outer Arm Commercial Corridor, the Vareth, Tessic Freight Lane, and the older, rougher Meridian Trail that most modern GPS systems tried to route drivers away from, and that therefore attracted exactly the kind of driver who didn't much care what the GPS suggested. It was not a glamorous place. The architecture was entirely practical, built for function and durability rather than aesthetics. Low structures of pale composite material that reflected the desert heat, fuel arrays stretching along the western perimeter. The cargo bays large enough to accommodate the full range of hauling vehicles, from the compact single-driver rigs to the massive articulated freighters that took up 3 standard bays and required a spotter just to dock. Alongside the Krethel settlement, which predated the depot by several centuries and existed in a relationship of careful mutual tolerance with it, there was a sprawling trucker's rest, a flat-roofed complex that had grown organically over decades as the depot's traffic increased, accreting repair shops and food stalls and bunk rentals, and a bar that went by 3 different names depending on which sign was currently lit. The kind of place that smelled like engine coolant and fried food, and the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from spending too many consecutive hours in a pressurized cab with nothing but your own thoughts for company. The beings who moved through it were as varied as the routes that fed it: Tessic merchants with their elaborate cargo manifests, Vareth locals running supply runs to the outer settlements, the occasional diplomatic courier trying very hard not to look like a diplomatic courier, and in largest number the long-haul drivers, the ones who lived most of their lives in transit, who had developed the specific economy of movement and expression that comes from years of measuring your life in fuel stops and waypoints, and the slowly accumulating weight of distances covered. Most of them never wandered near the hatching grounds. It was considered private Krethel territory, clearly marked, fenced at a respectful distance, and most species, particularly those who had been doing business near Krethel settlements for any length of time, had absorbed enough cultural awareness to understand that you did not intrude on the hatching ceremonies. The signs were clear enough. The fencing was adequate. The general social understanding was solid. But Dale Murchison had been driving a long-haul rig for 19 years across 4 star systems. And in that time, he had developed 2 habits that had served him both well and poorly in roughly equal measure, depending entirely on the circumstances and who was keeping score. The first habit was that he never took the marked path when an unmarked one looked interesting. This had led him, over the years, to several genuinely remarkable discoveries and 3 situations that had required significant paperwork to resolve, and he had decided somewhere around year 12 that the ratio was acceptable. The second habit was that he never walked past an animal in distress without stopping. He had picked this one up from his grandmother, a woman who had lived her entire life within 15 kilometers of the town she was born in, and had nevertheless managed to accumulate, at any given time, somewhere between 4 and 11 animals of various species and temperaments who had all arrived in her life through the simple mechanism of her being constitutionally unable to pass a creature in need without doing something about it. He had inherited this quality the way you inherit certain things. Not consciously, not deliberately, but so thoroughly woven into the fabric of who you were that it never occurred to you to question it until someone pointed it out, usually in a tone of mild exasperation. He wasn't even sure the little thing was in distress. He had come around the eastern perimeter of the trucker complex, following what he had assessed as an interesting gap between 2 buildings that suggested a shortcut to the fuel arrays, and had found instead the long fence line of the Krethel hatching grounds, low and plainly marked. He had been about to simply parallel it back to the main path when something in his peripheral vision snagged his attention. A pale shape, alone, in a small depression in the sand, surrounded by what he recognized after a moment as the curved remains of hatched shells. It was just sitting there, in a pit full of empty shells alone, while the rest of the ground around it showed the signs of recent activity: smoothed sand, careful foot-track patterns, the remnants of what had clearly been a more populated space not long ago. He stopped. He was not sure why exactly. It wasn't doing anything alarming or particularly plaintive. It was just sitting there in the sand alone in a pit ringed by empty shells. But something about the stillness of it, the specific quality of a small creature that has learned not to make noise because noise has never in its experience produced results worth the effort, hooked something in him that he couldn't have named precisely but that he respected enough to follow. He crouched down at the low fence, elbows on his knees, and looked at it. It was small, smaller than he would have expected, though he was uncertain what his expectation should be, not being an expert in Krethel hatchlings. Pale, almost luminous in the early afternoon light, its scales so lacking in pigmentation that he could see faint traceries beneath the surface that might have been the suggestion of underlying structure. Its eyes, when it turned them on him, were a color he didn't immediately have a word for, not quite pink, not quite red, somewhere in between, like the inside of a particular kind of shell. Or like the sky in certain moments just before a sun that was not quite the same color as Earth's sun finished setting. "Hey," he said, the way a man talks to a stray cat, not expecting a response, not trying to perform anything, just making the small verbal acknowledgement that said, "I see you," in the most uncomplicated way he knew how. The hatchling turned its pink eyes on him. Dale had seen Krethel before. They were common enough at busy depots, reptilian in their overall architecture, fast-moving when they wanted to be, their scales usually running in shades of deep amber or rich brown, occasionally a darker forest green in the older individuals. They bonded with partners in their youth, one partner, for life, a relationship that the xenobiological literature described as a form of neurological co-regulation so thoroughgoing that long-term unbonded Krethel showed measurable cognitive and emotional decline that bonded individuals simply did not experience. They spent their lives as companions, navigators, emotional anchors, partners in whatever sense of the word applied to the specific shape of the bond they had formed. The galaxy's most sophisticated support animal, some called them, in the kind of reductive shorthand that made the Krethel themselves furious, because it missed the entire point. The bond was not one-directional, was not a service being rendered by a lesser creature to a greater one. It was a partnership, two nervous systems learning to operate in genuine relation to each other. The Krethel gave as much as they received, possibly more, and the historical record of what happened to the partners of Krethel who died before they did was not a cheerful document. Dale had learned most of this from a Tessic freight coordinator named Orvath, who had been bonded to a Krethel named Sen for 30 years, and talked about her the way certain people talk about music they love, with a kind of helpless precision, always aware that words were the wrong tool, but using them anyway because they were the only tool available. He had never seen a white one. He stayed crouched at the fence for a long moment looking at it, and it looked back at him with those rose quartz eyes. It did not approach him, did not retreat from him. It simply looked with an attention that felt, in a way he was not entirely prepared for, like being genuinely regarded, not observed, regarded. There was a quality to it that he associated with people, the specific sensation of being seen by something that was actually paying attention, not just processing your presence but actually taking you in, forming some kind of assessment, arriving at some kind of conclusion. "You're something," he said softly, and was not entirely sure what he meant by it, only that it was true. The hatchling blinked at him. It was a slow blink, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of blink that in the body language of certain species carries the specific meaning of "I acknowledge you and I have decided you are not a threat," and which in this particular moment also seemed to carry something else, a quality Dale was not sure he could have described to anyone without sounding like the sort of person who attributes too much inner life to animals. But it seemed to carry the full weight of 3 days of patient waiting, the sense of something that had been holding a very specific kind of stillness, and had, in the moment of this blink, allowed itself to release some small portion of it. As if the waiting had just, in some minor but meaningful way, changed character. As if it had shifted from waiting for something unknown to waiting for this, specifically now that this had arrived and crouched down at the fence, and said hey in the tone of a man with a grandmother who collected strays and a 19-year habit of stopping when something in him said to stop. Dale stayed at the fence for another few minutes, not saying much, watching the hatchling watch him. The afternoon light moved. Somewhere in the trucker complex behind him, a rig engine turned over with the particular deep cough of a cold start. The twin moons of Vareth, barely visible in the daylight sky, hung pale and patient above the desert. He had a delivery window to meet in 6 hours. He had a pre-trip check to finish, a fuel log to close out, 2 messages from dispatch that he had been ignoring since morning because they were almost certainly about the manifest discrepancy on the last run, and he wasn't mentally ready to deal with that yet. He didn't move. The hatchling blinked again, slower this time, and Dale had the distinct and slightly unsettling impression that it was being patient with him, that it understood he had other places to be and other things pulling at him, and that it was simply going to wait, with the same quiet certainty it had brought to the last 3 days, for him to figure out what he was going to do. He exhaled through his nose, looked at the empty shells around it, looked at the pale shape of it against the sand, the faint luminosity of those scales that hadn't been given the pigmentation every textbook said they were supposed to have, the rose quartz eyes that had turned on him the moment he spoke and had not looked away since. He thought about his grandmother. He thought about the particular quality of a cab at 3 in the morning on a long, empty route, when the silence stops being peaceful and starts being something else. A weight, a pressure, the specific texture of a solitude that has gone on long enough that it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a condition. He had been living inside that condition for about 6 years. He had gotten good at not thinking about it directly. "You're waiting for something," he said quietly to the hatchling. It wasn't a question. He wasn't sure it was even really addressed to the hatchling exactly. It was more the kind of thing you say when you are standing at the edge of a decision and the act of saying something true out loud helps you understand what you're actually thinking. The hatchling looked at him with those faded rose eyes. He stood up slowly, his knees complaining in the way they had started complaining about 3 years ago when he'd stopped being a man who thought of himself as someone whose knees might complain, and looked toward the nearest structure of the Krethel settlement. There were figures moving at its edge, shell mothers, he thought, recognizable by the particular long garments they wore and the deliberate quality of their movement. He looked back at the hatchling one more time. It waited. "Okay," he said, to no one in particular, or possibly to both of them, or possibly to the grandmother he'd been thinking about, 3-star systems and 15 years away. "Okay." And he went to find someone to talk to. The choosing. Elder Savarith found the human there 20 minutes later, still crouched at the fence, still talking to the hatchling in a low, even voice. She had been alerted by one of the younger shell mothers, Teravath, barely 10 years into her role, who had come to find her with the particular expression of someone who has encountered a situation that falls outside their training and would very much like to hand it to a superior. "There is a human," Teravath had said at the eastern fence line, talking to it. Savarith had taken a moment to finish what she was doing, which was reviewing the codex passage on unbonded hatchling transitions for the 4th time that morning in the faint hope that it would say something different, and then she had set the codex down and walked to the eastern fence. The human was large, she registered that first, the way you register weather as a simple environmental fact. Broad through the shoulders, long in the leg, currently folded into a crouch that looked like it required more structural commitment than it did, as though the body had made peace with getting close to the ground even when the ground was inconvenient. His back was to her. His voice, carrying back over the still desert air, was low and even, the cadence of someone not performing speech but simply producing it, comfortable in the sounds of his own language even when the audience could not possibly understand them. She caught perhaps one word in 4. Her translation implant was calibrated for trade languages and the more common commercial dialects. And this was something older, English, she thought, one of the root languages of the human homeworld, still spoken by a subset of the species with a tenacity that linguists apparently found either admirable or baffling depending on their disposition. What she could make out, assembled from context and the fragments her implant managed, was something about roads. Long roads. A system of them connected, spanning an entire continental landmass of a planet she had never visited, built in a period of that species' history when they were still entirely confined to a single world and had poured considerable energy into the question of how to move across it efficiently. He was describing distances. He was describing the particular quality of driving through the night on an empty road with the land flat on both sides and the stars overhead, and how there was a specific kind of freedom in it that he had never found a replacement for, no matter how many star systems he had crossed since. The hatchling was listening, with a focus it had not shown to any of the 200 bonding candidates who had passed it by. Savarith stopped walking and simply observed for a moment, because she had learned in 40 years of shell mothering that the moments just before you intervene in something often contain more information than the moments after. The hatchling was pressed close to the near edge of its pit, not against the fence yet, but oriented toward the human with the kind of whole-body attention that Krethel physiology expressed in lieu of the facial expressiveness that other species relied on. Its tail was still. Its breathing, which she had learned to read across 3 days of close observation, was slower than it had been at any point since the hatching. Slower and deeper. The breathing, she knew from long experience, of a Krethel whose nervous system was doing something that felt to it like coming to rest. She had seen this before. Not often, the genuine *Versathi recognition was not a common event to witness in its first moments. Most bondings developed over the course of a ceremony with time and intention built in around them. But she had seen it twice in her 40 years, both times between Krethel and their chosen partners, and it had looked like this, exactly like this. The settling, the slowing. The orientation of an entire small body toward a single point in the world, as though that point were the place everything made the most sense. She had not expected to see it oriented toward a human, but she found, standing at the edge of the eastern perimeter with the afternoon heat pressing down and the codex passages she had memorized since girlhood running through the back of her mind, that she was less surprised than she perhaps should have been. Human, she said carefully. He looked up without startling, the movement of someone accustomed to being approached from behind, who had either excellent situational awareness or had simply spent enough years in places where being startled was a luxury you couldn't afford. He took her in for a moment, the way people take in things they were not expecting, and then his expression settled into something open and uncomplicated. He was weathered in the way that people who spend their lives moving through open spaces get weathered, not worn down but worn in, the distinction being that the former implies damage and the latter implies a kind of seasoning. Sun-lined deeply around the eyes, with the particular lines that came from squinting into a lot of different kinds of light across a lot of different kinds of sky. Broad-shouldered in a way that seemed structural rather than cultivated, the body of someone who had done physical work long enough that it had simply become the shape of him. And there was a stillness about him, even in the act of looking up at her, even in the moment of being caught doing something he might reasonably have expected to be questioned about, the easy stillness of someone who was comfortable in their own body, who did not use movement to manage anxiety because they had found some other way to manage it, or perhaps had simply made a long peace with it. "That your little guy?" he asked. "It belongs to no one," Savareth said. "That is the difficulty." He looked back at the hatchling. Something moved through his expression, not quite recognition, not quite the thing she had been watching in the hatchling, but something adjacent to it, something that rhymed with it. "Looks fine to me," he said. "It is an albino." She paused, assembling the framing carefully. She had explained this before to off-worlders who had wandered near the grounds during ceremonies and had questions, and she had learned that the explanation that was accurate was not always the explanation that was useful. "Among our people this is considered." She chose the word with the deliberateness of someone who knows several more precise words and is deliberately setting them aside. "Inauspicious." He repeated it the way people repeat words they are testing for weight and meaning, not parroting but genuinely tasting. "Inauspicious. Then that mean bad luck." She considered the gap between what it meant and what those words conveyed. "It means unwanted," she said finally, because that was the truth at the center of it, stripped of the 6,000 years of textual scaffolding that surrounded it, and she was too old and had been at this too long to dress it up into something less stark than it was. The word landed in the air between them with the particular weight of true things said plainly. She watched it hit him. He was not a man who flinched, she thought, or not obviously, but something in the set of his shoulders changed by a small, precise degree, the way a structure shifts when load is added to it. The hatchling, as though it understood, and Savareth had long since stopped assuming that hatchlings did not understand things simply because they lacked the language to respond, did not look away from him. "What happens to it?" he asked. His voice had not changed in any dramatic way, but the low evenness of it had taken on a different quality, a careful flatness that she recognized as the tone of someone asking a question whose answer they are already partly dreading. "If nobody takes it." Savareth was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain of the answer, but because the answers to certain questions deserve a moment of genuine acknowledgement before they are said. A breath of space that admits this is not a small thing to say or hear. "The deep sand," she said finally, using the Krethel phrase because she had found over the years that the translation created a kind of distance that was almost worse. The human language equivalent was direct in a way that the Krethel phrase softened slightly through metaphor, through the image of returning something to the earth rather than the blunter mechanics of what that actually entailed. She was not sure the softening was honest. But she used it anyway, because she was not sure brutal clarity served anyone better in this particular moment. He was quiet too for a beat. A single, complete beat of silence in which she watched him process it, not dramatically, not with any display of the emotion she suspected was present, but with the quiet internal work of someone who has received a piece of information and is fitting it into their understanding of the situation and deciding what to do with it. Then he stood up, his knees producing a sound that she associated with biological aging in several species, a dry, percussive protest from the joints, and he looked at her directly. There was something different about the quality of his attention now. Not harder exactly, but more deliberate, more committed. "I'm not Krethel," he said. "I know your bonding's supposed to be between your people." He glanced back at the hatchling once, briefly, and then returned his gaze to her. "But if you're putting it in the deep sand otherwise, I'd like to put in a different option." Savareth studied him for a long moment. She had the advantage, in her 40 years of shell mothering, of having observed a very large number of beings in the specific moment of making a decision they were not entirely sure about, and she had become reasonably expert at distinguishing the decisions that came from impulse and the decisions that came from something deeper and slower and more considered. The impulsive ones had a particular energy, a brightness, a momentum, the quality of something moving fast enough that it hadn't entirely caught up with itself yet. This did not have that quality. This had the quality of a decision that had been, in some part of him, already in progress before he had ever spoken to her, before he had stood up, possibly before he had even registered consciously what he was going to say. A decision that his body had already made and that his mind was now simply finding the words for. She had seen this before too, though less often. It was the quality of a rightness being acted on, rather than an impulse being followed. In 6,000 years of Crethel tradition, a bonding with a non-Crethel partner had happened exactly 4 times. She had looked this up once years ago, out of curiosity rather than any expectation of relevance, and had read the 4 case records with the interest of a scholar encountering the genuinely unusual. It was not prohibited precisely. The codex did not say it shall not be asterisk, because the writers of the codex had not anticipated it clearly enough to legislate against it. It was simply considered so far outside the expected range of events that no formal framework existed to address it, which meant, in the particular logic of the codex, that it defaulted to the discretion of the presiding shell mother. Who was, in this case, her? She was aware of this. She was also aware in the same moment of the hatchling. It had moved while she and the human were speaking. Not dramatically, not with any sudden urgency, with that same patient, deliberate calm it had maintained across 3 days and 200 candidates. But it had moved. It was pressing itself now against the fence on the side closest to him, its pale body against the lower rail, its rose-quartz eyes fixed on him with an expression that Savareth had spent 3 days learning to read, and that she now understood without question as the expression of a creature that has found what it was waiting for, and is communicating this as clearly as its current physical situation will permit. Toward him unmistakably, undeniably, with the wholeness of a very young body that did not yet know how to want things by half measures. You understand, she said slowly, because this was the part that mattered most, the part that had ended 3 of the 4 historical cross-species bonds in difficulty. Not the initial choosing, which was the easy part, but the living inside the choice afterward, that Crethel bonds are not pets. She watched him receive the word pets with a slight adjustment of his expression that suggested he had been about to say something and had reconsidered. They are partners, she continued. They will have opinions and they will find ways to express them that will not always be comfortable for you. They will argue not in your language, but you will understand them nonetheless. That is the nature of the bond, and you will not always enjoy what you understand. She paused. They will know when you are lying and they will tell you so. The corner of his mouth moved. Sounds like my ex-wife, he said, and then something in his face shifted immediately, a man catching himself mid-step. Sorry, that was Flip, I didn't mean, he stopped, started again with more care. I hear you, I understand it's serious. I'm not walking into this thinking it's going to be simple. You travel constantly, she said. It was not quite a question. She had been watching the trucker complex from the settlement's edge for 40 years, and she had learned to read its inhabitants with reasonable accuracy. The wear on him was not the wear of someone who moved through spaces occasionally. It was the wear of someone for whom movement was the primary condition of existence, the life of a long-haul driver. I do, he said it without apology and without performance, the plain acknowledgement of a fact. Then a pause, she watched him reach for something, watched him decide to say it rather than keep it back, which was a small but meaningful choice. But I travel alone, have for about 6 years now. He looked at the hatchling, at the pale small shape of it pressed against the fence toward him, patient and certain and unmistakably present. And honestly. He stopped, she waited. Alone gets heavy after a while, he said. Quietly, without drama, without any apparent expectation that the admission required response or comfort. Simply a true thing stated in the way of someone who had already made their peace with it being true and was stating it now not to elicit sympathy but because it was relevant, because it was the part of his answer that the question required. Savareth looked at the hatchling. The hatchling was still looking at the human. It had been looking at him without meaningful interruption since the moment he had crouched at the fence and said asterisk hey in the tone of a man who stopped for strays. And in that sustained, unbroken regard she could read, with the clarity that 40 years of watching hatchlings had given her, something she had not seen on this particular youngling's face in the 3 days she had been watching over it. She could read relief. Not happiness exactly. The hatchling was too young and too unformed yet for the complex layered thing that happiness became in mature Crethel. But relief. The specific physiological and emotional signature of a nervous system that has been holding a sustained, effortful state of waiting, of readiness, of patient alert attention, and has received the signal that the waiting is over. The muscles along its spine, which she had learned to read as a kind of barometer, had released a tension she had not consciously registered as tension until it was gone. Its breathing had settled further into that deep, slow rhythm. Its body, still pressed against the fence toward him, had the quality not of straining toward something but of already arriving. The expression on its face, and she had been told by off-worlders that Krethel faces did not have expressions. Which she had always found more revealing about the off-worlders than about the Krethel was the expression she had no precise word for, the one she had seen twice in 40 years between bonded pairs in the moment of recognition. The expression of absolute settled knowing. Of a creature that has found the specific thing it was built to find and is in no further doubt about anything. It had simply been waiting for the correct person to arrive. And now the correct person had arrived. And the hatchling was, in the only ways available to it, communicating the profound and uncomplicated fact of this with everything it had. Savarith stood for a moment longer in the afternoon heat. With the weight of 6,000 years of tradition and 4 case records and 40 years of her own experience all present simultaneously in her mind. And she looked at a pale hatchling that her people had called unwanted and a weathered human who traveled alone and had said, without self-pity but with simple honesty, that alone gets heavy after a while. She thought about the codex. She thought about the deep sand. She thought about the 200 candidates who had looked at this hatchling and looked away, and whether their looking away had been the failure of their perception or the simple truth that they had not been the right person, and whether those were different things or the same thing. She thought about what she had said to the ceremony elders. The matter requires further consideration. She reached down and unlatched the gates. It was a simple mechanism, a standard safety latch, nothing ceremonial about it, the same hardware she operated a dozen times a day. The sound it made was small and ordinary, a click of metal on metal, barely audible over the ambient sounds of the desert and the distant depot. The hatchling went through the gap immediately, without hesitation, without looking back at the pit or the shells or the settlement behind it. It moved across the sand to the human's feet and stopped there and looked up at him, and the quality of the looking was different from any looking Savarith had observed it do in 3 days, not the patient, sustained regard of waiting, but something more active, more present. The look of something that has arrived and is now beginning. The human looked down at it. He was very still for a moment, the way people are still when something unexpected has moved them and they are deciding what to do with being moved. Then he crouched down slowly, bringing himself closer to its level, and the hatchling did not back away. It stepped forward instead, one deliberate step, and pressed the side of its pale head against his extended hand with the gentleness and certainty of something that has been waiting a long time to do exactly this and is finally at last doing it. Savarith watched the human's face. She watched the thing that moved through it, complex, layered, not entirely nameable, but somewhere at its center something that rhymed with what she had seen in the hatchling's face. The particular expression of a creature that has, unexpectedly and somewhat against the prevailing odds, found what it needed. "Hi," he said softly, just that one word to the small pale creature pressing its head into his palm. Not hey this time, something quieter, something that had traveled a shorter distance to reach him, something almost like an answer. The hatchling closed its eyes. Savarith clasped her hands together before her and stood for a moment in the professional stillness of someone who has just witnessed something that will take time to fully understand, and who is giving it the respect of not immediately trying. There were forms, there were conversations still to have, with the ceremony elders who would have questions, with the Krethel Council whose awareness of a cross-species bonding would be required, with the human himself about the practical and philosophical dimensions of what he had just entered into. There was work ahead for her and considerably more for him. But those were the things of the next hour, the next day, the next weeks and months of transition and adjustment, and the slow accumulation of a shared life that neither of them could fully imagine yet. Right now, in this moment, with the afternoon light going long and golden across the desert, there was only a man and a hatchling at the edge of an open gate, and between them the early, fragile, entirely unmistakable shape of something that had found its way to where it was supposed to be. She let them have the moment. It seemed the least she could do. Mile marker. The post went up on a Tuesday, which was not a day Dale had planned for it. He had been sitting in the cab at a rest stop outside Vareth Station's outer belt, a long, flat stretch of consolidated gravel that served the eastbound freight corridor, lit by a single overhead lamp that had been amber once and had faded through long use to something closer to the color of old bone, and Ghost had been asleep on the passenger dash. Which was unusual enough that Dale had spent the first 10 minutes of the stop just watching it sleep, rather than doing the maintenance log he was supposed to be doing. Ghost didn't sleep like a small animal. It slept like a philosopher, with the profound, committed stillness of something that had considered rest and found it worthy of full investment. Its chest moved in long, slow intervals. Its eyes were closed in that complete way that always struck Dale as slightly extraordinary, given that he had never quite gotten over the initial surprise of those rose-quartz irises, that when they were absent the whole face looked subtly different, like a familiar landscape missing its most distinctive landmark. He had been watching it sleep and thinking in the loose, unstructured way his thinking went at the end of a long run about the last 6 months. And then he had picked up his phone, opened the HFY subreddit that he had been a lurking member of for years, reading it in rest stops and fuel queues, appreciating its particular brand of humanity does the unexpected storytelling even when he felt no impulse to contribute to it himself, and started typing. He had not planned to write a long post. He was not by nature or training a long post kind of person. His communications ran to the efficient, dispatch confirmations, brief check-ins, the occasional message to his sister that was mostly logistics. But something about the particular quality of that rest stop, the amberbone lamp, Ghost sleeping with philosophical commitment 3 feet away, 6 months of something he still did not entirely have the language for sitting in his chest, had loosened something, and he had written for 45 minutes without stopping, which was more consecutive writing than he had done since a school assignment 30 years ago that he had also, now that he thought about it, produced in a single unplanned burst at an unlikely hour. He had posted it before he could edit it into something shorter and more guarded. He had titled it with the nomming instinct that had also produced *Ghost*. My co-pilot has opinions about my music. An update. The update was technically inaccurate since he had never posted about any of this before, but it had felt right in the way that certain small inaccuracies feel right. It implied a continuity, a story already in progress, which was true even if the subreddit hadn't been present for the earlier chapters. Then he had put his phone face down on the seat, closed his eyes and slept for 6 hours. What he had written in the 45 minutes of that unplanned outpouring had started as a practical accounting. The hatchling named Ghost, because Dale Murchison had the nomming sensibility of a man who owned 3 black t-shirts and had once named a truck the situation without irony, had taken to the life of long-haul trucking the way that some creatures take to water. Not gradually, not with the careful negotiation of a being learning a new environment, but completely and immediately, and with a confidence that suggested it had always known this was its life, and had merely been waiting for the appropriate vehicle in which to live it. This was, Dale wrote, either deeply reassuring or mildly alarming depending on how you looked at it. He had decided to find it reassuring. Ghost had established its position within the first hour. The passenger dash, a long, flat surface that in Dale's previous solo years had served as a shelf for coffee thermoses, manifests he meant to file, a CB radio that had stopped working in 2031 and that he kept out of a vague sentimentality he had never examined closely became, by Ghost's clear and non-negotiable assessment, the correct place to be. Not the sleeper cab, which was available and temperature-regulated and would by any reasonable external standard have been the more comfortable option for a small reptilian creature. The dash. Specifically, the section of the dash with the best forward sightline, wedged between the thermos and the defunct CB, positioned to see the road ahead with an unobstructed view. Ghost watched the road the way experienced navigators watch the road, with the focused, proprietary intensity of someone who has not been asked for input and fully intends to provide it anyway. Dale had learned within the first week that this was not passive observation. Ghost had opinions about the road, specifically about the decisions being made regarding it. The music situation had developed more gradually, but with equal firmness. Dale's driving playlist had been assembled over 19 years of long-haul travel and represented, he had always felt, a reasonable cross-section of human musical achievement. Classic rock, unambiguous. Ghost tolerated it with the equanimity of someone who has decided the aesthetic is not personally to their taste, but is willing to coexist with it for the sake of domestic harmony. Country, which Dale had grown up with and retained a complicated affection for, was accepted under specific conditions that he had taken several weeks to fully map. Ballads, yes. Anything with a particular style of production that Dale associated with a certain decade, no. And anything that foregrounded steel guitar in a specific key caused Ghost to reposition itself slightly further from the speakers. Which was the mildest available form of critique, but was deployed consistently enough to constitute a clear policy. The True Crime podcast had been the clearest statement. Dale had been working through a popular series during a night run 3 episodes in, having found the host's voice companionable in the specific way that voices become companionable over long dark hours of empty road. When Ghost had stood up from its position on the dash, turned around with great deliberateness, descended via the gear console to the cab floor and walked into the sleeper section, Dale had heard it settle. The curtain between the cab and the sleeper was not fully closed, and in the glow of the dashboard instruments, he could see the pale shape of Ghost curled on the bunk with the specific posture of a creature that has removed itself from an objectionable situation and is waiting for the situation to resolve. Dale had turned off the podcast. Ghost had returned to the dash within 4 minutes. He had interpreted this as a critique of the genre and also, he wrote, possibly a moral stance. He had not gone back to the podcast. He was not entirely sure whether this was because he respected Ghost's position or because the silent judgment of those rose-quartz eyes was more than he wanted to navigate at 2 in the morning on an empty freight corridor. Probably both, he admitted. The rest-stop instinct had been the thing that had taken Dale longest to fully trust, and which he had ultimately come to trust more completely than almost anything else in his professional life. Ghost had opinions about rest stops. Not all rest stops, some were assessed as acceptable, entered without comment and exited the same way. But certain stops, seemingly at random, produced in Ghost a response that Dale had learned to read across its gradations. The mildest was a subtle repositioning, a shift in posture that communicated something without specifying it. The middle register was a more active alertness, the body orienting toward the windows, the eyes moving in a scanning pattern that Dale had initially found inexplicable. The strongest was a pressing close to Dale specifically, not panicked, never panicked but deliberate, the specific movement of a creature that is communicating stay close asterisk without having access to those words. He had overridden it twice in the early months because the stops in question had looked normal to him, had shown up normally on his GPS, had been listed without incident flags in the freight corridor database. Both times within 12 hours, those stops had appeared in incident reports. Nothing catastrophic, one a theft ring operating out of a rest stop's blind spot, one a medical situation that had gone unresponded to for several hours due to a communication blackout that nobody had flagged. Not things Dale had been in danger from necessarily, but things that had been asterisk wrong in some way that Ghost had apparently perceived and he had not. He did not question the system anymore. He had tried once to research whether this was a known Krethel ability, some form of environmental sensitivity, chemical detection, subsonic perception of human distress, anything that would give him a mechanistic framework for what Ghost was doing. The xenobiological literature was, on this point, genuinely unclear. There were studies suggesting elevated sensory sensitivity in Krethel across several modalities. There were papers arguing that bonded Krethel showed measurable attunement to their partner's physiological states. There was a rather good monograph from a researcher at a university Dale had never heard of arguing that the Krethel navigational instinct, the thing that made them exceptional partners for traders, travelers, long-haul operators across multiple species, was not purely sensory, but involved something that the paper called asterisk situational integration asterisk, a capacity to synthesize environmental data across more channels simultaneously than most species could manage, into something that functioned less like analysis and more like intuition. Dale had read that paper twice and found it useful not because it fully explained Ghost, but because it made him feel less like he was describing something supernatural when he tried to put it into words. Ghost was not magic. Ghost was processing more of the world than Dale could process, and arriving at conclusions faster and communicating them in the only ways available. He was simply, at this point, wise enough to listen. The moment with his brother's phone call, which he had included in the post because it was the example he kept returning to, had happened 3 weeks before he wrote it. His brother Marcus, who lived in a fixed location and called at irregular intervals, and with whom Dale's relationship was complicated in the specific way that sibling relationships become complicated when one sibling leaves and the other stays, and neither of them has ever fully talked about what that meant, had called on a Thursday evening while Dale was prepping for a night run. Dale had picked up the phone, Ghost had stepped on it. Not aggressively, not in the way of a creature trying to prevent something through force. In the calm, deliberate way of a creature that has assessed a situation and made a decision and is communicating that decision through the most direct available physical means. The screen went dark under Ghost's foot. The call went to voicemail. Dale had sat for a moment, looking at Ghost, who looked back at him with those eyes that always seemed, in moments like this, to be carrying more information than it was possible to transmit through eye contact alone. He had not called back that evening. He had called back 2 days later, on a morning when he was rested and the route ahead was clear, and his head was in a different place than it had been Thursday evening. And the conversation with Marcus had been not easy. It was never entirely easy, but better than it would have been. Better in specific ways that he could trace back to not having had it Thursday evening in the particular state Thursday evening had put him in. He could not explain why Ghost had known. He could not explain what Ghost had perceived in him, or in the moment, or in whatever complex integration of signals Ghost was always conducting at a level Dale did not have access to. He knew only that it had been right and that his instinct to override it had been wrong, and that he was increasingly of the view that his instinct to override Ghost's assessments was almost always wrong, and he was adjusting accordingly. I know it sounds like I'm describing a pet asterisk. He had written because he knew it did, and he wanted to address it directly rather than let it sit as an unacknowledged ghost, lowercase different ghost in the room. The Krethel elder warned me it wouldn't be like that, and she was right. Ghost is not a pet. Ghost is the most opinionated co-pilot I've ever had, and I've had 3 human ones. It knows when I'm in a bad headspace before I do. It has woken me up twice at rest stops for reasons I still can't explain that turned out to matter. Last week it refused to let me call my brother, physically stepping on my phone, and I cannot explain why that was the right call, but it was absolutely the right call. He had paused there in the writing of it, because what came next was the part he had been circling for most of the 45 minutes, and had been circling, in a larger sense, for most of the 6 months. What I'm saying is, the Krethel thought this hatchling was unlucky because it was white. I think they were measuring the wrong thing. He had sat with that sentence for a while before continuing. It was the sentence that had been forming in him since the afternoon at the fence, since the elder had said it means unwanted, and the word had landed in the air between them with the weight of true things said plainly. Since the hatchling had pressed the side of its pale head against his extended hand, with the gentleness and certainty of something that had been waiting a long time to do exactly this. He had been thinking about measurement, about the things that get used as proxies for worth and the gap between the proxy and the actual thing, and how that gap tends to be invisible to the people inside the measuring system and visible to almost everyone outside it. He was careful to note to himself, under any illusion that he was a particularly perceptive person. He had walked past plenty of things in his life without stopping, had made plenty of decisions based on the wrong metrics without noticing until later. But he had stopped at that fence, and he had crouched down, and whatever had made him do that, his grandmother's genes, 19 years of a road life that had worn down some of the more reflexive certainties, some combination of factors he would never fully inventory. He was grateful for it in a way that resisted easy articulation. Ghost wasn't waiting in that sand pit because it was weak or inauspicious or broken. It was waiting because it knew. Whatever it knew, the right person, the right life, the right road, it was patient enough to hold out for it. I'm glad one of us was. He had attached the photo almost as an afterthought. He had taken it 3 weeks into the partnership, during an afternoon run through a stretch of cracked, sun-gold landscape that he had driven 60 times without particularly noticing, and had noticed, that afternoon, with the fresh attention of someone whose perspective has been recently adjusted. Ghost had been on the dash, pink eyes half-lidded against the light coming through the windshield, the road unwinding ahead of them, the long shadow of the rig stretching out behind them into the landscape. He had taken it with one hand, angle imperfect, resolution unremarkable, the kind of photo that contains more than its technical quality would suggest. Ghost in the light, the road ahead, the shadow of the thing they were doing together stretching back and back. He had posted it without applying a filter, because it seemed wrong to apply a filter to something that was already, in his view, exactly what it appeared to be. He had woken to 400 notifications, and had for a moment believed something was wrong with his phone. By the end of the week, the thread had 4,000 comments. The moderators had given it a distinguished tag, which he'd had to look up the meaning of. A significant portion of the comments were from people who had their own versions of the story, animals they had stopped for, creatures others had written off, the particular experience of finding something the world had labeled as unwanted and discovering that the label said more about the labelers than the labeled. Some of the comments were from Krethel, or from beings bonded to Krethel, who wrote with the particular warmth of people who recognized something they knew from the inside. One from an account called *Versathi Observer*, had written a long and careful response about the history of albino Krethel hatchlings across the recorded centuries, about the handful of cases where they had bonded successfully and what those bonds had been like, described, in the historical records, as unusually deep, unusually stable, exhibiting a quality the ancient texts called *still water knowing*. The perception of someone who has learned to be very quiet and therefore hears more than those around them. The comment was the most upvoted response in the thread. Dale had read it 4 times. The top comment, though, was simpler. 6 words from an account he had never seen before and would never see again, posted in the first hour before the thread had grown large enough to make any single comment feel like it was speaking for the whole. That hatchling didn't get left behind. It got selective. Dale had screenshot it within 30 seconds of reading it. He had set it as his phone wallpaper that evening, in a rest stop outside a fuel depot on the Meridian Trail, with Ghost on the dash watching him with those rose quartz eyes and the patient attention of something that did not entirely understand phones, but had long since categorized them as an object that Dale had complicated feelings about and that occasionally required intervention. He showed Ghost the wallpaper. Ghost looked at the screen. Ghost looked at Dale. The nature of the looking was impossible to fully describe. It was the look that Dale had learned over 6 months to receive as something between assessment and recognition, the look of a creature for whom the internal and the external were not particularly separate things, who could apparently look at a man holding a phone with a screenshot of 6 words and understand something about the whole of what had led to that moment. Ghost thrummed. It was the low sound, the subsonic one. The one Dale felt in his sternum before he heard it with his ears, deep and resonant and satisfied in a way that the word satisfied only partially captured. Because it had in it something more than the satisfaction of a particular moment, something that seemed to run back further, to encompass the whole long patient wait in the sand and the gate unlatching and the 6 months of road since. All of it acknowledged and found to be, in Ghost's assessment, correct. Dale put his phone in his pocket. Ghost turned back to the road. The Meridian Trail stretched ahead of them in the long amber light of a sun that was not quite the same color as Earth's sun. The kind of light that makes familiar things look like they are being seen for the first time, and Dale Murchison put the truck in gear and pulled out of the rest stop, and they drove on together into it. The road was long, the road was almost always long, but the particular weight of it, the weight he had described to an elder at a fence in the desert as alone gets heavy after a while asterisk, the weight he had carried for 6 years without fully admitting how heavy it had gotten was different now. Not gone. He was not the kind of person who believed in things being simply gone. But different in the way that a weight distributed across two is different from the same weight carried alone. Not halved exactly but changed in character. Changed in what it asked of you, changed in what it left you with at the end of the long hours. Ghost Tail moved once, a slow and easy sweep, and settled. The road unwound. They went.